Gotcha.
I still remember having to choose my first weapon in Monster Hunter World. It's the first challenge that the game presents to you because it doesn't really restrict what weapon you start with, which weapon classes, and there's 14 of those weapon classes to choose from. So the question is, which of those weapons is best for you? You might be wondering which weapon is easiest, and finally you might also be wondering, what are the changes that these weapons went through when we got Iceborne? All the weapons kind of received some balance adjustments and maybe a little bit of change to their moveset. And my goal is to cover as much of that as possible in this video. Of course, there's so much information that if I miss any of it, feel free to share it in the comment section below, and that means if you watch this video, go check those comments out. Starting with the Greatsword, this is my #1 choice for new players. Okay, so if you're a brand new player to Monster Hunter World, this is the weapon I definitely recommend to you. The reason why, and the reason why it's so loved, is because it's a very simple weapon. It can guard. So, being able to guard incoming attacks is great for new players. It can tackle. The tackle basically allows you to kind of lunge forward, but rather than being knocked back by a monster's attack, you just kind of poise your way through it. You're like, you're made out of stone. And then its best move, the True Charge Slash, is very simple to use. You just press the same button 3 times in a row. You got to hold down the button, but that's it. So that's the Greatsword in a nutshell, and it's also not complicated to build for. Your main skills are Crit Eye, Weakness Exploit, Crit Boost, Master's Touch, Handicraft, and Focus. Those are your main skills for building damage on the Greatsword. And if you wanted to guard all moves, you would have to bring Guard Up, the Guard Up skill. You can get that from 2 pieces of the Uragon armor set. But yeah, so it's a terrific weapon if you like predicting the monster because you have slow, chunky attacks. It's got a powerful aerial attack. It was nerfed from the base game. It used to be more powerful. You could spam it by rolling off the ledge and then pulling yourself back onto the ledge. Some people call this aerial style. I call this ledge hopping. But that's been nerfed. And the other nice thing about the Greatsword in Iceborne is that part of your True Charge Slash combo now, instead of pressing the same button 3 times, you can press it once and then use a Slinger Burst and then press that Charge Slash button again. It's different for everything, right? Keyboard, PlayStation, Xbox controller. So I'm avoiding saying a specific button. But yeah, you can have the Slinger Pods in the middle of your combo now. And that's the primary change for the Greatsword. Everything else about it is basically the same, so it didn't receive a lot of changes. Let's move on to my favorite melee weapon in the game. You guys know that if you've watched a lot of my live streams, is the hammer. The hammer is a great weapon because if you can focus on the monster's head, you will actually knock them over, and what you're doing is you're KOing them. So it's a blunt weapon, just like the hunting horn and particular ammo types, particular attacks. It's a blunt damage weapon, and it deals KO damage, and when the KO damage is high enough on a monster, they fall over and the little stars pop up, causing a knockdown and giving your team an opening to deal lots of damage. It doesn't have the best range. The hammer requires you to get kind of close to your target, so you're going to have to learn how to dodge through a monster's move. You're going to have to learn how to read the monster and kind of outspace the moves as well, and that's most of the challenge for the hammer. The hammer, it spends a lot of its time charging up between 3 attacks. You know what? This isn't a hammer guide. Let's stick to the basic information. What's great about the hammer is a raw damage weapon just like the Greatsword is, so a lot of the times your builds are very uncomplicated. Crit Eye, Weakness Exploit, Crit Boost, probably Master's Touch, and then Handicraft. Just like the Greatsword, it's the same idea. In fact, the Greatsword, you have to build Focus. Well, you should be building Focus to get more damage. You don't even have to build that on the hammer, which leaves a lot of room for defensive skills like Health Boost and Divine Blessing Secret or Tool Specialist Secret. So this is a really, really diverse weapon where it also has a fast sheath time. So one of the things I like to do with the hammer is bring wide range. You can actually do a healer, a team healer setup. We're also doing plenty of damage. And then, this weapon's also terrific for aerial damage. I think it might be the best aerial weapon in the game right now, better than the Insect Glaive even. So when you go sliding down a hill, you can turn this into a mid-air spinning bludgeon. The other thing you can do is you can ledge hop. This is where you roll off the ledge, and then you press right trigger on a controller to pull yourself back onto the ledge. And this can be repeated over and over again for very high damage. You especially want to make sure that you have the airborne decoration or the skill in your build if you're going to be doing that. One of my favorite things about the hammer is the Big Bang combo. The Big Bang combo is really simple. You press one button over and over and over again for 5 turns, and then the monster takes a huge amount of damage. It really doesn't work on the monster unless he's incapacitated. So kind of the goal is to KO the monster or knock him over some other way, and then go ahead and big bang him in the head as soon as he goes down. For Iceborne, the hammers did actually receive a new move called the Flying Smash. It's really cool. The way it works is you can only use it at the end of a charged upswing or a brutal big bang. So a brutal big bang is totally different from a regular big bang. The brutal big bang comes from an actual charged attack. So you can either stop the charged attack at the charged upswing, or you can stop the charged attack at the brutal big bang. Once the move is over, you just push left trigger, and this causes the Flying Smash to come out. It's basically a clutch claw special attack. You know, it deals extra damage as you're clawing onto the monster. It looks really fancy, and you get to finish it off with more damage. It's very cool and helps you stay focused on the monster's head. Something you might not have known about the Flying Smash is that it even works at the end of a mid-air spinning bludgeon. So if you charge your hammer up to level 2 or level 3 before you go into the spinning aerial bludgeon, after the spinning aerial bludgeon is done, you can actually use a Flying Smash at the end of that. And now we're going to talk about the most popular weapon in the game by far, the longsword. This is the weapon that gets used the most. It's got a huge lead in the weapon popularity data. I've recently began using this myself. I've always known how to use it, but I've never spent a lot of time with it, and I've recently begun spending a lot of time with it, and it's easy to understand why it's so popular. It's because the weapon, once you kind of figure it out, it has such a good flow to it. You always have something to work on. You always have something to respond with, right? Like, one of the problems with some weapons, I want to say the insect glaive, is there's an optimal damage combo. It's a very straightforward combo, and that's it. You just dodge through the monster's attack and you use that optimal damage combo. With the longsword, it's a little bit different. It's got good vertical range, it's got good horizontal range, and the moves that you use are usually in response to what the monster is doing. And this creates a higher level of interaction, in my opinion. So it has a move like Foresight Slash. This gives you a special iframe that, when the monster's attack comes in, if you manage to iframe through the attack, it provides you with the reward for doing this, essentially. I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to try. Once again, this is not a guide video on how to use each weapon. That would take quite a long time, but eventually you get to use another cool move called Helm Splitter. That looks awesome. It's a high damage move that rewards you for being able to attack the monster over a prolonged period of time. It's kind of like True Charge Slash. The monster has to stand in place for a little while in order for you to pull it off. And then finally for Iceborne, the longsword goes on to receive two of the coolest upgrades of any of the weapons, EI Slash and EI Spirit Slash. If you use EI Slash at the right time, it's kind of like the Greatsword's Tackle. It basically allows you to ignore something that should have flinched you or should have knocked you down. Spirit Slash is even better. Spirit Slash is similar to Foresight Slash in the way that you're given a big reward if you iframe through an incoming attack. And of course, Spirit Slash has an iframe to it. It's hard to pull off, but if you do pull it off, it does high damage, and then you can move right into Helm Splitter. So yeah, it just continues to be this really well animated, very fun weapon that's very rewarding to learn. And similar to the hammer, it has a very simple build to it. Crit Eye, Weakness Exploit, Crit Boost, maybe Master's Touch, and then Handicraft, and that's it. You don't need anything else, so you can actually build quite a lot of defense with it. I would say that it's a little more complicated than the Greatsword in terms of its moveset. It's probably closer to the hammer in terms of complexity. So, but it's still, I would say, very early game or user-friendly, if you wanted to say that. All right, let's move on to the next weapon. Next, we should talk about one of my least used weapons, the sword and shield. You know, it's funny, Capcom advertises the sword and shield as being very beginner friendly. I don't actually agree with that. I think this is one of the harder weapons for new players to learn, and that's because there's a lot of complexity to using the sword and shield. You kind of have to know what you're doing in order to get the most out of it. Even shield-wise, it's not, none of the shield weapons come up with guard up, so it's not like having a shield automatically makes this game easy, because there's plenty of unguardable moves in the game. And then the shorter range on the weapon, I feel, is challenging as well. It does have approaches, right? Like, you can use certain moves to approach the enemy, but even with those approaches, if you're just standing in a neutral stance and not approaching the monster, you have pretty short range. So you kind of have to get right in there in order to get your damage output. You know what I mean? So let's talk about what makes the sword and shield the most fun. I would say right now there's two things I'm really enjoying. The uppercut. The uppercut is a new Iceborne move for the sword and shield. You have to have the weapon drawn, and then you have to roll, and at the end of your roll, you press left trigger, and this goes into an uppercut. The uppercut's this big leap, and it allows you to grab right onto the monster as if you were using the clutch claw. This has been buffed recently. That's a recent change. When the game launches for Iceborne, it will not be super powerful, but it does get buffed later. Capcom basically made it so that if you've used Uppercut, you can use one weapon attack while latched onto the monster, and this will cause a part softening. So I really do like the Uppercut right now. I think that's a huge improvement for Sword and Shield. The Perfect Rush is just okay in my opinion. I actually kind of liked the Falling Shield Bash. So that was from the base game, and I feel that both Falling Shield Bash and the Perfect Rush is another Iceborne move. I feel like they both really encourage raw damage builds. And I don't really know if there's a meta for elemental builds for the Sword and Shield at this point. I'd be curious to know about that. The same with the ailment builds. Do any serious speedrunners actually use crit ailment? Let me know in the comment section. I haven't done my research on that because I use the weapon so little, but I would be curious to know that. Some of the unique identities around the Sword and Shield would be its ability to use items while the weapon is drawn. So that's something that's always been in the game for the Sword and Shield. I find that that's okay, but you know, it already sheaths pretty quickly, so it's not that big of a benefit. And then there's other weapons in the game that sheath pretty quickly as well. And when you're playing the game really, really well, you generally don't need to sheath your weapon to eat. But if you were playing wide range and you were really good at Sword and Shield, technically you would be able to react sooner to a teammate taking damage and needing to be saved at a last second. You would be able to react faster with the Sword and Shield. It should have the fastest reaction. I don't know how big of a benefit that is if you're not really skilled at the weapon in the first place, and if the weapon's maybe trailing behind some higher damage option weapons. Now it's time to talk about one of the more complicated weapons in the game, the gun lance, one of the big shield weapons. You kind of move around with the gun lance using hops. You got a slow walking speed and a pretty slow sheath speed. So you're going to need guard, and you're going to need guard up so that you can guard incoming moves, or you need to learn how to iframe through monsters' attacks. The skill evade window can actually help you with that, as well as evade extender, two skills that you might take on the gun lance. Gun lance, of course, is an explosive damage weapon. When you use your shells, you're doing explosive damage, not blast damage. Blast is an ailment. Explosive damage, kind of like barrel bombs. It's a set kind of damage that isn't affected by monster weakness. It's not affected by hit zone values. It's just always going to do the same damage when you use it. You can eat Feline Bombardier at the canteen in order to increase your explosive damage. Also, the artillery skill increases your explosive damage. The magazine capacity boost, did I just use its name wrong? I think it's just called Capacity Boost. The Capacity Boost skill increases the number of shots you can have in your weapon, so technically that increases your explosive damage output because you're getting an extra shot before you need to reload. The Focus skill is useful for long shelling gun lance because it means that when you're attacking with the shell, you don't have to charge the shell for as long. It charges quicker because of the Focus skill. And this is very relevant because the best gun lances are long shelling gun lances in Iceborne. Let's talk about the Iceborne changes for this weapon. It actually did receive a substantial change where you're going to be using something called a Wormstake blast now, and a Wormstake blast is where you stick a wormstake into the monster, it physically stays there, and then you shoot your shells at it, and the Wormstake blast blows up when you shoot it with shelling, right? When you use explosive damage. Also, your teammates benefit from this too. So if your teammate uses like sticky ammo, it will get a little bonus damage from the Wormstake, right? So Wormstake's loaded into your weapon with slinger pods, and depending on how many slinger pods you had and what type of ammo type you had, when you stick it into the monster's body, it will stay there for various periods of time. Well, actually, it stays there for a long time. So that's what's cool about it. It's actually pretty strong. And the long shelling gun lance, the reason why it's so good is because it reaches that Wormstake really easily. I've always said this about long shelling gun lance. It has a ridiculous range, probably the longest melee range in the game if you count it as a melee attack. And I do count it as a melee attack because it has fairly limited range when you compare it to, like, I don't know, like a bowgun, right? It's not like ammo. It's not like ammo. The explosion does have a limited range to it, but it's still pretty damn long. So yeah, you'll stick the Wormstake into the monster's side, and then you'll shoot it with the long shelling gun lance. This will double your damage output, and this is how gun lance is played in Iceborne. Is a lot more fun, to be honest. One of the criticisms I had of the gun lance in the base game is it got kind of repetitive and boring. Not to hate on any gun lance lovers here. Gun lance, when we talk about weapon popularity, it's on the bottom half of weapon popularity, and even lower down the list. It's usually 4th place before last place, right? So 4 up from there. And I think it really is improved in Iceborne because once you stick that Wormstake into the monsters, it's kind of like having a headshot spot on the monster now. You kind of chase the target, and I think that adds a new level of interaction, but also a new level of damage output. If you haven't tried long shelling gun lance, you're really missing out. You need to try it so that you can realize how strong it is. That's enough about the gun lance. Let's talk about the hunting horn. Hunting horn was one of the weapons that received the most changes in Iceborne. It's always been kind of a less popular weapon. I mean, to be frank, it's at the bottom of the weapon popularity list. Okay, so it's one of the least played weapons, and it does receive really substantial changes in Iceborne, including a brand new attack. It's called Note 4. So the hunting horn has Note 1, 2, and 3 for its attacks, right? Well, now it has Note 4. It slams the handle down and it spins it. It's very cool looking, very epic, but it also included a number of new buffs in the game as well. And these buffs, I'm not going to cover them all here. There's too much to talk about, really, but they include a new sort of like offensive moves for the hunting horn in terms of buffs. So in the past, you would normally just buff your teammates, and that's all you did. You gave them like attack up large, which was the most popular buff, because of course it was. But now you can actually use a move like Impact Echo Wave or Dragon Echo Wave. And what it does is when you're using your performance and you're doing your little dance, you get this big explosion out of your horn that hits the monster for pretty good damage, and is pretty good at flinching the monster as well. So we like that as well. So substantial changes to the hunting horn have been made in Iceborne. The question is, will it affect the weapon popularity over time? That's what I'm really curious about. Let me know if this is a weapon you're interested in. It was actually the second weapon I learned how to use to play. I started with the lance, and then I learned after the lance, I learned the hunting horn before eventually learning the heavy bowgun. Moving right along, the last melee weapon I ever learned how to play, and I think it was the last weapon overall, is the charge blade. And the reason for that is because even though the charge blade has really satisfying chunky attacks, it's really complicated to use. It's called the charge blade, and that's a really fitting name because what you're doing is you're charging up these things called your files. So you charge them up by attacking with your sword while the shield is out, and then you store energy in those files, and then you use those files to do all kinds of things. And it's difficult to talk about this weapon without almost being like a guide because you kind of have to understand everything that's going on. There's impact files, there's elemental files, and these totally change how you use the weapon. But you'll store the charge of your files into your shield, and then you'll fill the files up again, and now you're ready to use more complex attacks. So I would describe this as the least easy weapon to learn how to use. It's the most complicated weapon. Probably I should get a guide out on how to use this weapon very soon. It's also very satisfying to use because once you've mastered it, it's capable of guarding. So it's a guarding weapon similar to the lance and the gun lance, and yet it has, I would say, better movement speed than the lance and the gun lance. It's capable of explosive damage setups. It's capable of elemental damage setups. And so there's a lot of flexibility to the weapon, and it's a very aggressive weapon too. You don't have to think of it as like a real kind of like defensive weapon like the lance. You actually play with it very aggressively. So there's a lot to learn about it. And again, I'll probably put a guide out for it pretty soon because there's probably worth putting a guide out for it. Those of you who already know how to use the charge blade, you know what I'm talking about. It probably took you a little while to figure it out, especially if this was your first Monster Hunter. You know, if you already knew about it, you probably figured it out pretty fast. Were there changes to the charge blade for Iceborne? Yes, there were. Now you're going to be using Savage Axe. Savage Axe most of the time is going to be your optimal damage output when it comes to attack combos, and getting used to how to optimally use the Savage Axe is its own level of craziness and difficulty. So in the past, you used to just spam an explosive damage move that we abbreviated as SAID, which I think stands for Super Amped Elemental Discharge. Forgive me if that's not right. But now in Iceborne, you're using Savage Axe, and this is a little more complicated because you're basically charging up the axe mode, and when it's charged up, your files are kind of like ticking down. They kind of just lose their charge slowly on their own, and if they empty out, your axe loses its charge. So it becomes this tricky game of actually keeping the files charged while keeping Savage Axe going, but using the attacks for Savage Axe as well, which include a moveset that was kind of being ignored in the base game. So these were already existing moves and you didn't use them, but now with the Savage Axe being your most optimal combo in the expansion, you actually have to learn how to use those moves at the appropriate time. And all of this just requires lots and lots of learning. And now let's talk about the Switch Axe. The Switch Axe kind of reminds me of the Greatsword in some ways. Doesn't it remind you guys of the Greatsword? But it's one of those morphing weapons too. So I've always found with the Switch Axe that the problem is you have very limited mobility and no shield, right? So the lance has limited mobility, but hey, it has a shield, right? So if you are in a pickle, you just guard. With the Switch Axe, you can't guard. You actually do have to iframe through the monster's attack. This might be another case where evade window might help, but in general, you're also trying to build up your damage really high on this weapon, so fitting evade window could always be tricky. It just depends on what you want to put in there. I mean, you can always fit some defense. What am I talking about? Anyways, this is a great damage dealer if the monster doesn't move. If you have an incapacitated monster, Switch Axe does a crazy amount of damage. It jumps between using a sword mode and an axe mode. It doesn't really matter, in both cases it's going to be dealing sever damage, but the challenge for using this weapon is kind of keeping the sword mode charged. And when you're using the sword mode while it's charged, you're kind of running out of energy to use the charge mode, and in order to bring the energy back up, you need to jump back over to the sword mode. So that's what's interesting about this weapon. This weapon was also always known for zero-sum discharges, this move where you can latch onto a monster, and then it's like you're releasing the power in the weapon into the monster. One of the nice things about the weapon is you can use zero-sum discharge while latched onto the monster with the clutch claw, which is one of the changes that it received for Iceborne. It received a number of other changes as well. For example, it received a way to basically charge the axe mode with the heavy axe slam. It's pretty straightforward. I also know that the Fade Slash was buffed on this weapon. Basically, Fade Slash is where you're attacking the monster and you decide to morph back into the axe mode, but you push back on your joystick as if you wanted to step back. And so when it transforms, it will actually reposition you really strongly by jumping back quite a bit. It does that more than it used to. I think in the end, one of the problems that the Switch Axe really is suffering from is it's more difficult to use than the longsword and the greatsword, but not necessarily more satisfying to use than the greatsword or the longsword. So I would be happy to see Capcom develop more of an identity for the weapon around this whole idea of it releasing its energy in the zero-sum discharge. So we know there's zero-sum discharge spamming, but I would just like to see something that is even more focused on the fact that you charge the weapon up and now you're releasing all the energy at a time. Another thing that happened to the weapon, unfortunately, see, it used to be unique in its ability to latch onto monsters. Other weapons didn't do that. Virtually all of the weapons do it now. So I feel like it kind of lost that part of its identity as a unique weapon, and I would just love for something new to open up for this weapon as well. But if you like it, use it. That's what I have to say. And now it's time to talk about my number one weapon, the weapon I've used more than any other weapon, the heavy bowgun. So the heavy bowgun and the light bowgun are two weapons that are fairly similar to each other. They have different movement speeds, and the heavy bowgun's allowed to use a shield as well as a few extra ammo types that the light bowgun doesn't get. But, you know, mechanically they're quite similar to each other. You aim at the monster and you shoot. What's fun about the heavy bowgun is there's a lot of reading you need to do. There's a lot of information about the weapon, and after you've learned how to use it, it actually becomes one of the easiest weapons in the game. In fact, a lot of the top speedruns right now are held by heavy bowgun spread ammo setups. We're talking about Loyal Thunder, that's a Zenogre heavy bowgun. So right now it's one of the highest damage weapons in the game, and it does lack mobility, but if you get good at rolling with it, I actually find it more satisfying than weapons that also struggle with mobility, like the Switch Axe. So Switch Axe, we were just talking about, it's got the little side hop. You know, it's just not very satisfying because it doesn't take you very far. Well, the heavy bowgun's roll always takes you very far, so it's useful for outspacing enemies at least. And you know when you're rolling with the heavy bowgun, the iframe's at the beginning of the roll. So just learn to roll at the very last second, and you'll manage to iframe just like you would with any weapon. On top of that, I already said it, add the shield mod. So the ability to guard with a weapon that has really far range with some of its ammo types, such as sticky, is actually quite powerful. We like the lance because it has a good shield. Well, guard with the heavy bowgun and you will also have more range than the lance has. The lance is supposedly a weapon with good range, right? But compare the range of the lance to the range of sticky ammo. It's not even close. Sticky ammo hits them across the map. Sticky ammo actually becomes the new cheesiest way to kill monsters in Iceborne. So if you're looking for a very easy setup, and I mean really easy, easier than the greatsword that we mentioned at the beginning. The greatsword's the easiest to learn, But if we're talking about the actually easiest setup, it's probably going to be sticky ammo on a heavy bowgun with the shield. You don't even have to dodge or outspace moves, just bring guard up and guard 5 or whatever, and then yeah, just stand back and sticky the whole time. And sticky ammo is interesting because if you shoot it in a monster's head, it's one of those ammo types that deals blunt. Well, I shouldn't say ammo types, it's one of those moves that deals blunt, right? The hammer deals blunt, hunting horn deals blunt, sword and shield, if you're using the shield, that deals blunt. Sticky ammo on the heavy bowgun and the light bowgun, it also deals blunt. So you just kind of stay away from the monster. Doesn't matter what range you're at as long as you can actually land the shot, and then yeah, it's going to explode a moment later for high damage. So it was actually buffed, the sticky ammo for Iceborne. That's one of the changes that occurred to the heavy bowgun. It received like some new mods. You can hold more mods on a bowgun. So if you're unfamiliar with mods kind of affect the ammo, recoil, reload speed. But yeah, you get to hold more mods in Iceborne on both the light bowgun and heavy bowgun. And then you have stuff like the scope. The scope was a pretty big change to the heavy bowgun. That's a new thing for Iceborne. The scope mostly affects normal ammo and spread ammo. Those are the two ammo types you're going to consider using it on. And the way it works is you look into the scope, and there's going to be 2 sets of reticles, and you kind of try to line those up by getting closer to the monster or getting further away from the monster. And when they line up, you get a nice big damage bonus, which we all love. We love damage bonuses. But for the heavy bowgun, it's really in a powerful spot, like it's always been in the base game. It's in a powerful spot once again in Iceborne. There's the inclusion of a new skill, True Spare Shot. True Spare Shot is giving you an even greater chance of not consuming your ammo when you fire it than the old base game spare shot. And this pairs with the cluster ammo. The cluster ammo was nerfed. You have less of it now. It has to travel all the way up and all the way down before it can explode. And Temporal Mantle was nerfed as well. So those are some major changes for the cluster ammo, but it's actually still really powerful. I do see speedrunners using the cluster ammo, and the Wyvern ammo also receives a benefit from the True Spare Shot. Jumping over to the light bowgun had some changes as well. Primarily what you see with the light bowguns is the evade reload. This is a new mod where for each level of evade reload that you have on your setup, when you evade twice in a row with the light bowgun after shooting, this triggers the special reload animation, and after you go through with it, your weapon is reloaded. And so people will use this when a weapon has a really powerful ammo but terrible reload, and they use that as a way to get around it. Now, I believe it was intentionally designed to be that way. They're like, hint hint, use the evade reload. But also there were some other changes to the light bowgun. For example, the rapid fire pierce level 2 ammo. We didn't have that in the past. There's the rapid fire sticky ammo as well. There we go. I was trying to remember what it was. Finally, probably the last change to the light bowgun that was really notable is it has the Wyvern Blast mod, and this turns the Wyvern Blast mod into kind of a counterattack. It's hard to use, and it takes up one of your mod slots, so I don't generally see people using this just because it's so difficult. But basically, if you fire one of these counter Wyvern Blasts into a monster's attack, it blows up for pretty heavy damage, like we're talking about 450 range maybe for damage output. If you guys are interested in using the bowguns, you're in luck. I actually do have a heavy bowgun guide. Go take a look at that. You can find it on my channel. And in general, I just use bowguns a lot. It's a terrific weapon. Again, it's kind of complicated at the start, but once you know it, it becomes one of the simplest weapons to use because it is literally aim and shoot. And when you learn the heavy bowgun or you learn the light bowgun, you kind of learn the other by default because they're so similar to each other, except for pretty much mobility, I want to say. And again, the heavy bowgun has like, what does it have? It has Wyvern Snipe, Wyvern Heart. Those are different from the light bowgun. And it has cluster bombs. It has Wyvern ammo. And those are different from the light bowgun as well. So, but that's it. It's just got a few different ammo types. Other than that, they're both pew-pew weapons. You just aim at the monster and you shoot. Now that we're done talking about the heavy bowgun and the light bowgun, why don't we move on to talking about the dual blades? The dual blades! The dual blades are like the sword and shield's edgier brother. It's like you dropped the shield and you said, no, I'm going to use 2 knives because I'm awesome. Basically, with this weapon, it comes with maybe low commitment. It's funny, though, because it also has a very, very high commitment move as well. And what we mean by commitment is when you attack, how fast are the animation recovery frames? So some moves, when you use them, you're locked in, you can't get out. And if a monster decides to attack you while you're in your animation, you're in trouble because you can't dodge. Well, the dual blade has some of the lowest commitment times with this attacks, as long as you don't go into Demon Mode's Blade Dance. So Demon Mode's Blade Dance, I should just call it Blade Dance that you're using while you're in Demon Mode, it has such a long attack animation. It's kind of similar to the Sade attack on the Charge Blade. I am pretty sure it's longer than the True Charge Slash on the Greatsword, unless you're including the charge time, but I don't feel like that's fair to include because when you're charging on the Greatsword, you can cancel it with the tackle, so I don't feel like that's fair to throw the charge time in there. So if you're just talking about the animation time, I think it actually takes less time to pull off a True Charge Slash. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Somebody probably knows. But yeah, so there's a big commitment for Blade Dance, but you know, all of Dual Blade's other moves are pretty low commitment, and then you have a very fast dodge, and a very fast sheath time. What I like about the weapon is probably how cool its moveset is. I think that when you're actually using the dual blades, you feel very edgy. Especially if you get the Beyblade attack off on a monster with a long body, is very satisfying. That's a sliding attack, similar to like the Hammer's got a sliding attack. So does the dual blade. It has a very cool sliding attack. There's some downsides to this weapon as well. It's not necessarily the highest damage weapon in the game. I think it actually did really poorly in the base game. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that, but I don't know how it's sitting in terms of the speedrun meta for the expansion Iceborne. I haven't heard anything spectacular about it. I know that you have to build Marathon Runner with the dual blades, and this is because when you're in demon mode, you're constantly consuming stamina. So Dash Juice and Marathon Runner together are kind of how you're managing that. It's like the bow, where you're trying to not consume too much stamina because your damage output is reliant on your stamina. So that's just another thing that you have to manage. But on the other hand, you do get all of your cool approaches and all of your fast attacks and your low commitment time unless you're using Blade Dance. I suppose the other thing I would say is it's an elemental weapon. And when it comes to playing the game, I feel like the challenge of using elemental weapons is you actually have to go make a bunch of elemental weapons. So if you're going to be using dual blades, every time a new meta comes out, you're going to have to go and get a thunder version of it, a water version of it, a dragon version of it, a fire version, you know what I'm saying? So if you're just using maybe some raw weapons, well, you can have a few raw weapons and just choose the strongest one for each category. Hammer, Greatsword, maybe Hunting Horn. I don't know. I hear that Hunting Horn actually uses elemental now, but I haven't explored that. But yeah, so when you got the raw weapons, you don't have to worry so much about having to upgrade everything. But that's not true for elemental weapons like the bow and the dual blades, where they're mostly elemental weapons. I'm also curious how they fit in with ailments too. I feel like we're going to see more crit ailment in the future, but I can't confirm that because I it's ongoing, guys. The game is ongoing, so I'm giving you this video now, but there's always so much being learned and always so much being tested. So yeah, I would be curious to see how crit ailment is fitting in on the dual blades. I wouldn't be surprised to find that poison or blast is becoming really meta for this weapon as well. Let's talk about one more downside for the weapon, because this is one of my least used weapons and I gotta have a reason for that. And I think one of the things that irks me the most for the weapon is it doesn't really have a great deal of vertical reach. Okay, so you don't have the best vertical reach, and honestly not the best horizontal reach either. I feel like it has better approaches than the sword and shield. The approaches, I think they deal more damage, the approaches do, and they're simpler and they're faster. So it does chase down the monster better than the sword and shield, but the vertical reach actually does kind of kill me, especially if you're trying to like cut a tail that's higher up off of the ground, and without spoiling anything, you will reach a point where you can't reach a tail on an important monster, and you're going to find that annoying. So that's just how it is for dual blades. That's always been their struggle. I guess it wouldn't bother me as much if the trade-off was that you were doing more damage than weapons that can reach the tail, like the longsword and the greatsword and the switch axe. See, if there was a trade-off where you dealt more damage for having that lower vertical range, I wouldn't care. I don't really think that trade-off exists. So that's probably what bothers me. Next question, did the dual blades receive some new moves in Iceborne? Yes, like all the weapons, dual blades did receive some changes. First of all, it receives the evade shot. The evade shot's pretty straightforward. Basically, when you're attacking the monster, you're given these opportunities to use an evade shot with left trigger. This consumes some of your slinger ammo and it fires the slinger ammo, and then you get an iframe during the actual evade shot. So that's pretty cool. The other move is going to be a new combo where you get to use a claw attack, a clutch claw attack, and it's going to be from your Demon Flurry Rush moveset. So you basically just use the Demon Flurry Rush combo by pushing the same button 3 times in a row, and then you're given a Clutch Claw option. Your character does a little flip and grabs onto the monster. And this is, is similar to, it doesn't really do extra damage, I guess, is what I would have to say. When you actually chain it into a Clutch Claw move, you don't get bonus damage for doing that. So I kind of wish you did, similar to what the hammer does. At least when you Clutch Claw onto a monster with the dual blades, the animation for your weapon attack is fairly short. I do like that about the dual blades in Iceborne. Since we just finished talking about one of the stamina-reliant weapons in the game, the dual blades, let's go ahead and move on to talking about the other stamina-reliant weapon in the game, the bow. So the bow, unlike the dual blades, is a ranged weapon, and so you can shoot it from a bit of a distance, and it is one of the most popular weapons in the game, unsurprisingly. Also, by the way, the dual blades, I don't know if I mentioned it, is also a very popular weapon still. So the bow and the dual blades are ranking pretty high in weapon popularity, but it's kind of not surprising for the bow to rank high because it's also ranking high in the speedrunner leaderboards, and that's because it's dealing really good damage. How is it dealing good damage? Power shot. It's always been about power shot. So the heavy bow guns have some of the best damage in the game because of the spread shot. The spread shot and the power shot are the same thing. Heavy bow guns have spread shot, bows have the power shot. It's the same thing with a different name. So we like that on the bow. You get close to the bow and it kind of shoots like I guess maybe a shotgun. I don't know what to compare it to. But it is dealing very high damage, and it feels more like a melee weapon than it does feel like a ranged weapon. So the bow guns, those feel distinctly like a gun. But with the bow, you're trying to keep kind of like an attack combo going, okay? And that's probably the part of it that makes it feel kind of like a melee weapon. So with the melee weapon, you know, you've got a series of attacks you need to do, and these vary and they change depending on what the monster's doing. The bow's kind of like that. And in fact, the bow has this move called the charging sidestep, where after an attack, you can use a special evade, and the evade keeps the charge level on your bow up, right? That's part of using the bow. You kind of keep your charge levels up to get more damage. Well, this is very similar to the longsword's foresight slash. You remember that move. That move is where you activate it at the right time, and this allows you to iframe through the monster's attack and then follow up with the punish. The bow's kind of doing that as well when it's using its charging sidestep. You try to iframe through an oncoming attack, and then you can follow up with a power shot, and the power shot's going to be at a, you know, kind of like charged up level, because that's exactly how the bow works. The bow has like these levels of charges to each attacks. It can go up to level 3, and if you're shooting from level 3, it does more damage. Well, when you use the charging sidestep, you keep it going, basically. So that's why we like charging sidestep, but it consumes some of your stamina. Oh no! So a lot of stamina management is going on with this, with the bow. It's just a part, it adds a little bit of complexity to the weapon that not all weapons have. So I would describe the bow in a few ways. It's kind of a glass cannon sort of weapon where you don't have a lot of defense and you do need to iframe through oncoming attacks. It's also probably one of the more expensive weapons to build for. You need mighty bow, you need spread shot, you need normal shot, and much more. You know, I mentioned stamina surge and constitution probably at this point. So it's kind of an expensive weapon to build for that's always starving for more skills. It's hard to build defensive skills when you're building for the bow because it requires so much for you to really get it going and get it really powerful. But it is also a ranged weapon, so you can kind of chill back away from the monster if you really wanted to and use more of your normal shots and not as many of the power shots. That would just be a big trade-off in your damage output. It's a very popular weapon. It's not hard to see why. It is because it offers a lot of opportunity for you to master the weapon, and then when you do master the weapon, it turns out it's one of the higher damaging weapons in the game. With the actual moveset, I would not describe this as one of the most complex movesets in the game. However, because you have to be good at iframing, I would not describe it as beginner friendly. Finally, let's talk a little bit about the changes for Iceborne. So there were some nerfs to the weapon, but it's like you don't even feel those. And then it did receive a new move called Thousand Dragon, and Thousand Dragon's a lot of fun. Basically, it's a move that consumes all of your pod ammo, and it just chunks it right into the monster. So when a monster goes down, you can power shot on that monster over and over again, and right before the monster stands up, you can use your Thousand Dragon since you know you're guaranteed to land it, and it just deals a ton of damage. The bow also has a really satisfying clutch claw weapon attack because you grab onto the monster and you attack them, and then you like flip off of the monster and you can shoot the monster as you're falling back down, so that's really fun. Now it's time to talk about the Insect Glaive. The Insect Glaive continues to be one of the more popular weapons in the game. I think it's a lot of fun because it's capable of jumping into the air on its own, and then it has all kinds of aerial attacks that it can go into. One of the problems, I would say, though, is it never really deals the best damage when it's mid-air. At the end of the base game, you are able to use aerial attacks, kind of like an aerial playstyle, on a few monsters. Mainly, though, Xeno'jiiva was the main monster, and you would use like a dragon damage setup, and you could just use it on him over and over and over again. Or you could use like an ice damage setup on him. I think I had an ice damage setup where you would just use aerial. This doesn't really exist in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, so there's no more aerial, even though you have a new aerial dive has been added to the moveset. is more of a move that you use as a reaction. So like if the monster is about to attack you and you know you can jump over it, you can jump over it and then use the aerial dive, the new Iceborne aerial dive move. And this can transition into your ground attacks again, which is mostly what you're going to be using. Because in Iceborne, your ground attacks are still your best attacks, unfortunately. I hope they change that. I hope they do kind of a similar thing that they did in World, where you could actually have crit element built into the weapon itself for free or something. I don't know. We'll have to see what they do. I think that they could make the Insect Glaive more powerful all kinds of different ways, but we'll just have to see what they go with. I think a lot of the complaints on the Insect Glaive is that because you're playing it on the ground, it's too similar to too many of the other weapons. We've talked about the dual blades, we've talked about switch axe, we've talked about longsword, and we've talked about the greatsword. These are all also sever weapons, as well as the Insect Glaive. They're all doing kind of the same job, and it's just like, if the Insect Glaive isn't doing as much damage as all of them, then it's just a worse weapon, strictly, right? So I feel like that's one of the problems Insect Glaive kind of runs into, is being able to jump into the air has to actually be worth it. So I recommend they just increase the aerial damage all around. I think maybe Capcom is afraid that if the aerial damage is too good, it's going to be too strong of a weapon, but I say they just throw that idea out and just go all in. Let the Insect Glaive be an aerial weapon. That's what I would say. The Kinsect is the same way it's always been. It does now have an upgrade. What you do is you can have your Kinsect consume one of your Slinger pods, and this means it's going to have kind of a buff to it after it consumes it. It's going to have more stamina, and it can grab like 2 of the buffs from the monster when you grab those buffs, and then you can bring them back and I guess fill up your buffs faster. But I feel like the buffs continue to feel like this needlessly, it's like a chore basically. It's this needless chore where you have to manage your buffs. You want to keep all 3 of them active if possible. Of course, what experts do is they activate red and white first, and then when they think red and white are going to expire, they grab orange, and this kind of, you know, increases the duration that they have red and white. So, but yeah, the buffs, you just are always managing them, and you're always managing the Kinsect, and you're doing all of this work to do less damage than maybe the longsword. See, I don't really understand the reasoning behind it either. And that's why the Insect Glaive ends up not being one of the weapons that I use very often, just kind of like everyone else. Despite the fact that it ranks very high on weapon popularity, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. No, I do know what I'm talking about. I suspect the weapon popularity list is biased, because I suspect it's actually still based on the weapon popularity from the base game. It would have been interesting if Capcom totally reset the list once Iceborne launched, but I don't think they did. So anyways, with the Insect Glaive, I'm just curious where it'll be in the future. I think it has a lot of opportunity as being one of the most interesting aerial weapons to play in the game, but it continues to play kind of like second fiddle to aerial hammer. Hammer just knocks it out, man. So we'll have to see where it goes, really. Alright, well that's enough about the Insect Glaive. Let's talk about the last weapon on our list, the Lance. So the Lance is also like the Hunting Horn in the sense that it's one of the least popular weapons in the game. In fact, on one of the platforms is at the very bottom in last place. It was also the very first weapon that I learned to use, so it also goes into the list of sever type weapons. You have slow movement speed, long sheath times. It's kind of a mid-speed weapon, and most of your attacks consist of pokes. You just poke the monster over and over and over again. It's a very simple moveset, and then when the monster tries to attack you, you counter guard the monster, or you counterattack the monster. That's when you guard and attack at the same time, and you just kind of keep your attack chains going, okay? So the Lance is probably the best weapon in the game for guarding. It also has the ability to chase after monsters using its dash attack, as well as being able to jump into the air and dealing a little bit of mount damage to get one free early mount on the monster. So it does, it does a number of interesting things. I kind of wish that the Iceborne changes to the weapons included this one thing. Let's talk about it. So for the Lance, people were surprised that the changes on the Lance didn't seem that substantial. Primarily what it got was a clutch claw synergy with this ability to guard. So you can counterattack with this weapon, right? We just talked about that, and that's one of the ways that you keep your damage up with this weapon. Well, now you can counterattack with the claw, but the problem with it is it turned out you can only counter claw physical attacks. So monsters use all kinds of elemental attacks like dragon breath and fire and ice and all this other stuff, right? You can't counterclaw those. In order for the counterclaw to work, it has to be a physical attack. I don't really see why Capcom felt the need to do this. It feels like a nerf on a weapon that already wasn't known for doing really high damage. So I just felt like that sort of handicap on the counterclaw, why don't we just remove it? I think that Capcom should consider removing it. And then the other change, I suppose you could say, is the ability to fire pods from behind your shield, which I don't know if that's really that necessary. It doesn't feel like it's really that necessary. Other than that, I feel like the lance is pretty much the same. It's got guard up when you go into the power guard now. So the power guard, you can go into a counterattack, and then instead of counterattacking, turn that into a power guard. And if you hold the power guard for a little while, it receives similar protections that you would get if you put guard up into your build. That's a skill. The thing is, I don't think anyone will actually skip putting guard up in their build if they're serious. So you're not going to pick up the lance and go, oh, I don't need guard up, it's in the power guard. You won't do that because it takes too long to get into the power guard. So if you want to immediately guard an incoming unblockable attack, you're going to have to add guard up to your build anyways. So I feel like this is a weapon that, similar to the gun lance, is ranking in the second half of weapon popularity, the bottom half, and the lance particularly is in a lot of trouble. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you've got these big shields that reduce your mobility, and they have a long sheath time, and they don't have powerful iframes for dodging. So you have this movement penalty for having a large shield, but at the same time, you still have to put all these skills into your setup in order to actually use the shield. You need guard up and you need guard. Those are the two primary, and you can build offensive guard as well. I think that's a cool new skill, but you're still stuck building guard up and guard, and that's kind of annoying. It works for the gun lance because the gun lance doesn't need much. You know, it needs artillery, focus, capacity boost, and then you're mostly set. Especially since we use long shelling builds now, actually have a lot left over. That's not true for the lance. For the lance, you need all the things all the other weapons need. Crit eye, weakness exploit, master's touch, handicraft, I think I already said crit boost. But yeah, you need all those things, and you know, it could even be more complicated. It could be one of those borderline elemental weapons where, hey, it would be nice if I could fit crit element in here as well. I think I said that right. Yeah, crit element. Sorry, the video is getting very long now, so my brain's starting to slow down. So yeah, it just feels like some of the weapons that were ranking low in the weapon popularity, like the hunting horn and the gun lance, received a lot of love. And then you have really popular weapons like the bow and the longsword that also received a lot of love. Thousand Dragons on the bow, EI slash on the longsword, right? So a lot of weapons received substantial changes that made the weapon fun in a new way. Well, the lance really just got the counterclaw, and the counterclaw doesn't even work on all moves, just physical moves. So hopefully Capcom sees this and sees that the lance isn't being used so much, and maybe they give it a little oomph or something. I would love to see some changes to the lance. What do you guys think? That's going to wrap up all of the weapons on this list. What did you guys think about it? Did the information I talk about help you decide what weapon you're interested in using? Let me know in the comment section down below. And of course, check out the comment section just in case. I'm sure I missed stuff that is worth talking about, because, I mean, look, we're almost at 50 minutes. It's really an information-dense game, and I hope you guys enjoy that. All right? Here's a shout-out for Fans Perspective for helping me organize my thoughts on some of this and doing a little bit of writing for me. And then now that I'm done with that, I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.